I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking about do-it-yourself education. Anya Kamenetz is a nationally syndicated writer. The Village Voice nominated her for a Pulitzer Prize for contributions to the feature series Generation Debt, which later became a book. Anya is now a senior writer at Fast Company and the author of DIYU, published by Chelsea Green. Recently, Anya spoke at the Smithsonian as part of the release of the Edupunks Guide. Welcome.
Thanks.
And welcome to the show. Well, if we can start, Anya, if you can tell us about what is DIY education? What does that mean?
Well, in the broadest definition, we're really talking about the vast majority of all learning. I mean, everything from a child learning to recognize numbers and shapes before they start school, to the lifelong perpetual learning that we all engage in as knowledge workers in a complex society. And really, the vast majority of what we do when our eyes are open, we're reading, we're interacting with people, and we're taking in new knowledge. Now, in the current world, with so much digital content available online and so much networked communication happening, the availability and visibility of DIY education has come to a new level.
And you think that that's going to replace or enhance universities, or how do you see that happening?
Well, there's two really powerful forces converging. You know, one is this transformation in the way that we connect and share information and exchange information globally. And the other one is these wrecking balls that are coming for the edifice of higher education as we know it. And that's the diminution of public funding, the rising tuition costs, and the just massively increasing demand for higher education all around the world. Not only is America falling far short of its goals to educate 60% of its students beyond high school, but there are tens and hundreds of millions of people around the world with demand for access to higher education, and brick and mortar institutions don't have the capacity.
And so in your view, people have to take it to themselves to create that capacity and to kind of figure out how to educate themselves?
I think the solution comes at many levels. I advocate for institutional change, I advocate for legal change, but ultimately, yes, I think that building on the strength that we all have as human beings and individuals to conduct our own learning, it only stands to reason that the more that we celebrate and create opportunities for do-it-yourself learning, the farther we'll go to stanching this gap and demand for education around the world.
But let's assume that there is this demand, and I think you're right that there is this demand. What do we do with the universities that aren't supplying this, aren't helping people achieve this demand?
Well, I really look at education from the point of view of the learner. And so I think that institutions are going to have to evolve and adapt to serve the needs of the learner. Some of them are going to specialize in creating open content, wonderful content that can be shared by people around the world. Some of them are going to focus on socialization aspects of helping people, mentoring them to create personalized learning plans, for example, to help facilitate and scaffold do-it-yourself learning. Others might specialize in accreditation to assess this kind of learning and allow the learning that you do in open networks to be translated into a credential. And institutions that do none of these things, that try to stay with the model that has been working for them in the past, I don't think are going to survive.
Fair enough. But so you're essentially saying that there's going to be a separation of the different functions within the university.
I do see that happening.
Okay, and if that happens, then I assume then that we're going to have a separation between the content and the credentialing or the degree.
I do see that happening. Yes, absolutely. And I think that we're very far down the path of that evolution right now, because whereas the traditional model of the university is a place where research and teaching come together under one roof, in fact, half of all students today are in community colleges where research is not a major function. So we already see that kind of bifurcation and stratification happening. The challenge is, can you go from stratification to unbundling and have these new kinds of institutions still connected through existing networks?
But how do we unbundle that? Because it's an interesting idea. I mean, it's probably common knowledge that you went to Yale University. That's a pretty significant university. Would you have the career you have now had you not gone to Yale?
I would say that there is a tiny percentage of universities that are going to continue to maintain their function as door openers and gatekeepers. It's half of 1% of all students who get the chance to attend such an institution. And we really have to look at what the mass future of higher education is going to be like, and how people are going to qualify themselves and join the table of opportunity if they can't get through the bottleneck of these few elite institutions.
But let's take the non-elite institutions. Let's say I'm a bus driver in New Orleans, and I have a son or daughter, and my son or daughter would like to get an education. You're suggesting they do go to college or they don't go to college?
I am suggesting that there needs to be multiple pathways to success. And the traditional institutions, many people, such as the types of families you mentioned, are finding them far too expensive and far too inflexible. So the average college student today is much more likely to be older, to be supporting a family while they're going to school. That's why they need options like online learning. They need options that can meet them where they're at for any time, any place, styles of learning. And I would argue that the ability to certify the type of learning that people are doing informally in their communities is another really great way to open the door to formalized education for people who may not be able to access it today.
And that makes sense. I mean, as you probably know, I've written a lot about the cost of college and how this debt, the student debt, is really a problem for a lot of people. But what I'm struggling with a little bit is some of your work, which is fascinating, is how do we take that bus driver's student, right? Because we want to give a path for that bus driver student, and we want to unbundle the thing, but how do we actually do it today? I understand that in the future we'd like to do it, but let's assume that student right now comes to us and says, what do I do with my future right now? And yes, they can watch the Khan Academy stuff, they can look at the open source network stuff, they can go to your site, but that's still not a credential if they're trying to get a job in New Orleans.
So I spell out in the Edupunks guide the blueprint that I believe for how to do this today. And basically it consists of, first of all, formulating a plan for your own learning. You really have to do some self-searching, and people are going to need to do this with the help of mentors and friends and pastors and people in their community that can help them. And the goal of a personal learning plan can't just be to get a credential. That's not an end in itself. It has to be a job or a field that they want to enter. Then I suggest that you take advantage of the many open courseware and learning opportunities that are out there. And then the crucial step is to qualify that learning. So there are national services that exist for credit by exam, credit by portfolio, and individual institutions that specialize in credit for prior learning. So for those who are interested in pursuing a DIY path, there are ways to make that path sort of backwards compatible with the existing institutions that we have today. And I believe that that can consistently and very significantly lower the cost and even the time to degree for students who may be taking a more circuitous path through the realms of higher education. So for example, I talked to a mother of two who is looking to re-enter the workforce, and she tried many times to get a math credential, and this is something that's stopping her from earning her degree. So she went to a company called Straighter Line, which offers courses that are very low cost, that are based on open source content, and she worked through it at her own pace. She was able to access for a fee some one-on-one tutoring services, and she got her math credential during the summer while her kids were at the pool.
Which sounds terrific, but what about the person who's not quite as motivated as that person who you're talking about?
Well, I think I would argue that the system that we have doesn't particularly serve the unmotivated learner.
Fair enough.
Right now, for students that are the first in their families to go to college, only 11% end up completing on their first attempt. So what I'm talking about is alternate pathways for people who have perhaps some previous experiences with higher education that weren't so amazing, and they had the experiences maybe of not feeling like they measured up, and an opportunity to reevaluate and redefine their experiences and perhaps get credit for what they've missed, catch up on the gaps, and piece that together into a degree that's going to help them move along on their path.
Does any country right now do anything like that?
Well, it's very interesting, to look at the places where there's a green field for innovation in higher ed. So India is a really great example of this. It's going from having, 1% of people involved in higher education to having hundreds of millions of people now. Still a very, very low percentage. And there is a vast proliferation of all different kinds of ways for people to participate in higher ed. There's an Indira Gandhi Public University with 1.4 million students They all participate online. They go to testing centers to complete their work. There's a huge investment by the private sector in workplace-based training to get people up to speed. There's lots of private institutions that are coming in to fill in the gaps, and people are hanging out shingles as kind of unregulated teachers. And there's a huge amount of degree fraud. So, if you have an unregulated open marketplace, there's going to be a problem with verification. And so what ends up happening is that the private sector, in order to identify talent, they have to put a little bit more work out on their end to verify people's skills, and they administer a lot of tests to see if you actually qualify, whether or not you have a degree on a piece of paper.
And so then that's, in your view, why the IITs are so powerful in India?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, there is an existing hierarchy in higher education in India that is going very, very far to create the workforce that they need, but it's not enough because the demand for education is just so great. And that's what I see happening really around the world.
Well, this is interesting that we're talking about India for two reasons. One, I don't know if you know, Arun Gandhi was on the show recently, not talking about degrees, talking about nonviolence. But the interesting thing I find about India is that there are a lot of Indian students who come to the United States to get their degrees. Mm-hmm. So you're basically arguing, if I'm hearing you correctly, that there are multiple things happening in India and multiple things that you think are going to happen in the United States to the education sector all at the same time.
Well, I think they are happening in the United States as well. I mean, and many of these things that are happening are global events, right? So when you look at MIT OpenCourseWare, for example, 100 million people are using it in 200 countries. So it's very much a global phenomenon. And in fact, Yale recently had an issue where a series of lectures that was placed in the Open Yale Courseware website, very, very popular in China by Robert Schiller, economics professor, and was actually adapted and taken down and turned into a book that was published by a Chinese publisher with no credit back to, of course, Yale. But it's a really fantastic example of the hunger and thirst for knowledge that's around the world and the way that this technology makes it possible for people to engage.
Which I think is exciting because, of course, more people can learn more things and it's more convenient. Right. But I guess the issue that comes back to, that I at least come back to in this idea, is what happens, who's creating the content and who's creating the knowledge, and what's the infrastructure for the creation of that knowledge?
Well, the wonderful thing about digital resources is that once one person creates it, it can be used unlimited number of times by unlimited number of people. So we have an existing hierarchy in higher education. There's a very small number of institutions that are very well funded and established in perpetuity, essentially, and they are going to continue to be on firm financial ground because people want to pay for that exclusive experience. But because of the digital future, they now have the ability, and I would argue the obligation, to make those materials available to the entire world for free, and that's exactly what's happening.
Huh, that's interesting. And do you think that not only should a school like Yale or Harvard or MIT make their content available, but do you think they should use some of their endowment funds to fund some of that?
Well, they are, absolutely. And I mean, MIT, for one, is in careful cost-benefit on this. They spent, $15,000 a course up front, more or less, to put their 1,900 courses online. And they believe that it's really redounded to the university in terms of the currency that it has worldwide, the name, the reputation, and this is something that can only enhance the brand of an institution like that. And by the way, I mean, I'm not just talking about the Ivy League. Many people would argue, and people here in DC at the Department of Education have argued, that any public institution that has a stated public mission to share knowledge and to make it freely available needs to be using digital resources and open resources to do that, because that's the new definition of what public access is about.
Well, in fact, you probably know this is a public institution where we're sitting right here. This is, the University District of Columbia is a public institution. And so we do try to do the best we can to make sure as much content, certainly from the show, is out to the broader world.
Right, and that's absolutely an example of that.
But let's go to let's move to like the other institutions in society that are affecting learning. The symphony, the sports teams. What do you see happening with education and those institutions?
Well, as you mentioned, I just came from the Smithsonian where I spoke, and they again are a public institution, a museum that has an obligation to share and disseminate knowledge. That's part of its mission statement.
Right.
So again, what we're seeing with the advent of the digital commons or the open educational resources movement is that every institution has to think about, what is my online presence? How am I sharing and making this content and knowledge available? And the interesting thing is that, there's more models for DIY learning, I think, in that informal space. Anywhere that people are gathering purely for amateur reasons or reasons of interest, they're engaging in this kind of informal learning that isn't necessarily connected to a degree. And so we can take a leaf from that kind of learning, the learning that happens in libraries and museums, in sports complexes and in botanical gardens, and use it as a template for what a self-organized learning future might look like.
But where does the money come to support those libraries?
Well, we have an existing public infrastructure. It's not disrupted by the fact that there are more people taking advantage of it. If anything, you can look at stuff like public radio, right? With the advent of podcasting, there's many, many more people who get to take advantage of public radio and therefore pay to support it.
Right, but I mean, public radio is an interesting example, but in terms of the libraries, the librarians I know complain that they don't have enough resources.
And how does the DIY future interfere with that?
Because in my mind, the question is, if you're driving more people to the libraries, which of course is great, we want more people to take advantage of the resources in society. So where is the money coming from to support, yes, MIT's got the money to do it, but does the DC Public Library have enough money to sustain a huge infusion of people coming in to use all their resources?
Well, if you create an online library, you can have every city in the nation collaborate to make it available and freely publicly available online. So you're not increasing necessarily the demands on the resources of any one particular library in order to do that. That's the beauty of how digital and open resources work.
Fair enough, but I mean, you know, I go to the library sometimes and it's always crowded.
Yes.
Anyway, what's throwing me off about this is that...
Yeah, I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
What's throwing me... maybe I'm not being clear. What's throwing me off about this is I think that your open source kind of initiative that you're promoting is the future, and it's very powerful. But what I'm questioning is how that intersects with the institutions right now. And I know that you said before that the thing that you care about are the learners, and I think you're right. But we have invested as a society a ton of money in libraries. We've invested a ton of money in public institutions like this one and other universities. What do we do with them?
They evolve to meet this future. I mean, I guess, you know, the creation of digital resources and the availability of people to interact with public resources and information on a broader scale only enhances the mission and the purpose of these institutions, and therefore the justification for supporting them.
Fair enough. And then the other thing that you've spoken about a little bit is the issue of the generational divide. And a lot of people certainly in the 20 to 30 age cohort are carrying around a ton of student debt. Do you think that there's a limit to how much student debt that people should take? And do you think that there is, do you think that by definition, every generation should kind of be able to advance more than the previous generation? Well,
I talk to students about a rule of thumb that says that they shouldn't take on more student loan debt than their starting salary upon graduation, their expected starting salary. So we're edging into the danger zone because the average loan debt for graduating students is $24,000. And BAs in the liberal arts are making about $27,000 starting out. So that's very close to that tipping point. And when you come to, for example, a doctor who wants to pursue primary medicine, or a lawyer who wants to go into you know, a regular middle-class practice, helping fellow neighbors with divorces and that type of thing, the debt load is clearly unsustainable. So I think that we are at a national tipping point when it comes to the student loan burden that people are incurring. Now the broader question, you know, the thesis of my book, Generation Debt, in 2006 was that my generation, the millennials, were in a very specific situation of being the first generation of Americans not to do better materially than their parents did. And that's clearly been borne out over the past decade. We're seeing it right now. The percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds who are jobless is higher than at any time in the last 3 decades. And that's whether you are a graduate of college or not a graduate of college. Obviously, the burden falls disproportionately on the undereducated, but the problem is very, very real. And you know, the question that you ask, you know, is it right of us as a society to not improve the prospects of each generation over the one previous? This is an existential question. I think in order to answer that question in the negative, we're going to have to redefine what the American dream is all about.
And in your mind, the American dream includes whose responsibility to whom? So do we have a societal responsibility to have an education? Do we have does the government have an obligation to provide us all an education? Or does the government simply have an obligation to kind of gently show us where we could find it if we want to?
Well, the definition of providing an education has always been a slippery one, because there is a basic contradiction between meritocracy and democracy. If we say that we're going to provide access to education for all, and yet actually access to higher education is determined by not only your income, your background, your ability to go to school and not have to work 30 hours a week at the same time, but also your ability to pass the SATs and your ability to compete and do college level work and to do, and to participate in education. So it's not just it's not like healthcare where you can simply say everybody's entitled to a certain amount of this healthcare and to a certain level of health. Whether or not we live up to that is a different question. But when you talk about education, you're rationing education. You're always rationing education by people's ability to take advantage of it. So the government's obligation becomes very, very complex in that scenario.
And in your mind, should the government do more to fund more students to go to universities, or should we use the money to then fund the initiatives for more open source content?
Well, I am going to revert to the words of Hal Plotkin, who's a special assistant to the Undersecretary of Education, and he says that to the degree that governments are not supporting open educational resources, they're abandoning a fundamental responsibility to their citizens. The government has two things that they can do. They can fund a textbook that's printed on paper in a certain number of copies and given to a certain number of classrooms, or they can fund a digital textbook that is effectively unlimited. And which one is a better use of the government funds, I'll leave up to you.
All right, fair enough. We're going to be out of time in a second, but a question about hybrid learning. In your view, do you think that this hybrid learning should be a kind of combination of classroom work and maybe TED Talks?
So the Education Department did a big meta study on online forms of learning, and they found that learning that combined online and in-person instruction was the best of all. It was better, best of both worlds, essentially. And rather than answer the question about specific kinds of content, what we're really talking about is an approach of flipping the classroom. And so what that really means is you make the students responsible for taking in the knowledge through digital content. They don't come to class to sit in a lecture, because that's exactly the kind of passive imbibing of knowledge that is best done through digital media, sitting and listening to someone else talk. The time that you spend in the classroom, the very precious time, should be spent on one-on-one work with students on individual goals and peer-based collaborative work where they're interacting with other people.
So then you're also making the case that there's a big difference between active and passive learning.
Sure.
Okay, and in terms of how are we going to then use the open source software in such a way that, and content in such a way that it's as active as it can possibly be?
Well, we've been spending a lot of time talking about open content, but in the Edupunks guide, I talk also about open socialization platforms. So, for example, there's a platform called Open Study, which is basically an environment of live study groups, and anyone can get together and join a study group on any piece of content. It's linked to the MIT OpenCourseware site, so if you want to take a particular problem set from engineering and work on it with other people in real time, it's capable for you to do that. So platforms like Quora, question and answer format, Twitter, which is like more of a river, real-time feed, social bookmarking services, these are all different ways for people to enhance their interaction and the social part of learning in an online world, and also in an open world. It's free, it's available to everyone.
But I guess my final question is the issue of what about the people who don't have access to some of these materials online? I mean, there are a lot of people in the you're from New Orleans, as we saw during Katrina. I mean, not everybody in New Orleans has the resources that, the average American does. And it's, in a lot of ways, a very poor city.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who don't have resources and don't have the even ability to get online to see some of these, these things. So how do we access and help people who are in that position?
It depends where our focus is. I mean, the creation of new advantages and enrichment means the creation of new disadvantages, right? When you open up a digital opportunity, there becomes a digital divide. So the question is, what's the best use of our resources? Should we be spending it to prop up institutions that continue to grow in the amount of money they spend without growing in their productivity? Or do we spend the money on resources that can serve everyone and allow them not only to be served with content passively with education, but to engage in learning actively on their own?
And I think you make a fair case for why we should do that. But I guess I come back to the issue of government and the institutions. You know, we spent a lot of time as a people, as Americans, to build up these institutions. It would be a shame to throw them out.
Well, I mean, that's the sunk cost model, where you lament what you've done and it stops you from changing and moving forward.
And that's a fair point. And why don't we end on that note, because we're going to be out of time in a second. But I think you made a very fair case for why we should move forward, take the future, make it now, and do the best we can and hope that our institutions evolve as best they possibly can.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. Right. If you would like additional information about Anya Kamenetz or the Edupunks Guide, please visit edupunksguide.org. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.